It is with a heavy heart that I take up my pen to write these last memories of my remarkably gifted friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. In these incoherent and, I admit, not always successful sketches, I have attempted to describe some of the experiences I shared with him, from our first chance encounter during the period of study in Scarlet to the time when, by his interference in the matter of the naval treaty, he undoubtedly prevented serious international complications. With this narrative, I intend to bring my memoirs to a close and never again touch upon the event that left a void in my life, one that has remained unfilled for 2 years. It is only the recent letters of Colonel James Moriarty, in which he defends the memory of his brother, that compel me to set forth the facts exactly as they occurred. I alone know the whole truth, and I am glad that the time has come when there is no longer any need to conceal it. As far as I am aware, only 3 accounts of my friend's death have appeared. In the Journal de Genève on May 6th, 1891, in a Reuters telegram published in the English press on May 7th, and finally, in the aforementioned letters. The first and second accounts were extremely brief, while the last, as I shall now demonstrate, utterly perverts the facts. I am, therefore, duty-bound to provide, for the first time, a true account of what actually transpired between Professor Moriarty and Mr. Sherlock Holmes. It should be noted that following my marriage and the growth of my private practice, my close relations with Holmes underwent some change. Occasionally he would call upon me when he desired a companion in his investigations, but this happened less and less frequently, so that for the year 1890, I have records of only 3 cases in which I participated with him. During the winter of that year and the early spring of 1891, I gathered from the newspapers that Holmes had been engaged by the French government on a matter of great importance, and I received 2 notes from him, from Narbonne and Nîmes, from which I gathered that his stay in France would likely be a long one. I was, therefore, somewhat surprised when, on the evening of April 24th, he walked into my consulting room. I was struck by his pallor and his even more pronounced gauntness. "Yes, I have been overworking a little," he remarked, answering my look rather than my words. "Lately there have been many pressing matters. Would you mind if I closed the shutters?" The room was lit only by the lamp on the table at which I had been reading. Holmes stepped to the window, and having swung the shutters to, bolted them securely. "Are you afraid of something?" I asked. "Yes." "Of what?" "Of a shot from around the corner." "My dear Holmes, what do you mean? I think you know me well enough, Watson, not to consider me a nervous man. But in my view, to fail to recognize imminent danger is more a matter of stupidity than of courage. May I trouble you for a match?" He drew on his cigarette, as if finding some solace in it. "I must apologize for calling at such an hour," he said, "and furthermore, I must ask your permission to leave your house by way of the garden wall." "But what is this all about?" I asked. He held out his hand, and by the light of the lamp, I saw that 2 of his knuckles were burst and bleeding. "As you see, it is no trifle," he said with a smile. "Injuries like these could cost a man his hand. Is Mrs. Watson at home?" "No, she is away on a visit." "Indeed? So you are alone?" "Quite alone. In that case, it will be easier for me to propose that you come away with me to the continent for a week." "Where to?" "Oh, anywhere. It is all the same to me." It all seemed very strange. It was not in Holmes's character to take aimless excursions, and besides, his pale, haggard face told me that his nerves were strung to the highest pitch. He noticed my questioning look, and, leaning forward with his fingertips together and his elbows on his knees, he explained the situation to me. "You have probably never heard of Professor Moriarty?" "Never." That is the genius of it. Holmes cried. The man pervades London, and no one has heard of him. That is what allows him to break all records of crime. I tell you in all seriousness, Watson, that if I could successfully outwit this man and rid society of him, I should consider my career reached its summit, and I should be prepared to turn to some more placid pursuit. By the way, my recent services to the royal family of Scandinavia and to the French Republic have left me in such a position that I could lead the quiet life, which is congenial to my tastes, and concentrate all my attention on my chemical researches. But I cannot rest as long as a man like Professor Moriarty is free to walk the streets of London. And what has he done? His career has been an extraordinary one. He is a man of good birth and excellent education, endowed by nature with a phenomenal mathematical faculty. At the age of 21, he wrote a treatise which enjoyed a European reputation. On the strength of it, he won a mathematical chair at one of our smaller universities and had, to all appearances, a most brilliant career before him. But the man had hereditary tendencies of the most diabolical kind. A criminal strain ran in his blood, which, instead of being modified, was increased and rendered infinitely more dangerous by his extraordinary mental powers. Dark rumors gathered around him in the university town, and eventually he was compelled to resign his chair and to come down to London, where he set up as an army coach. So much is known to the world, but the rest has been entirely my own discovery. As you are aware, Watson, there is no one who knows the higher criminal world of London quite so well as I do. For years past, I have continually been conscious of some power behind a malefactor, some deep organizing force which forever stands in the way of the law and throws its shield over the guilty. Again and again in cases of the most varying sorts, forgery cases, robberies, murders, I have felt the presence of this force, and I have deduced its action in many of those undiscovered crimes in which I have not been personally consulted. For years I have endeavored to break through the veil which shrouded it, and at last the time came when I seized my thread and followed it, until it led me, after 1,000 cunning windings, to ex-Professor Moriarty, the celebrated mathematician. He is the Napoleon of crime, Watson. He is the organizer of half that is evil and of nearly all that is undetected in this great city. He is a genius, a philosopher, an abstract thinker. He has a brain of the first order. He sits motionless, like a spider in the center of its web. But that web has 1,000 radiations, and he knows well every quiver of each of them. He does little himself. He only plans. But his agents are numerous and splendidly organized. Is there a crime to be done, a paper to be abstracted, we will say a house to be rifled, a man to be removed, the word is passed to the professor, the matter is organized and carried out. The agent may be caught. In that case, money is found for his bail or his defense. But the central power which uses the agent is never caught, never so much as suspected. This was the organization which I deduced, Watson, and which I devoted my whole energy to exposing and breaking up. But the professor was fenced round with safeguards so cunningly devised that, do what I would, it seemed impossible to get evidence which would convict in a court of law. You know my powers, my dear Watson, and yet at the end of 3 months I was forced to confess that I had finally met an antagonist who was my intellectual equal. My horror at his crimes was lost in my admiration at his skill. But at last he made a trip, only a little trip, but it was more than he could afford when I was so close upon his heels. I had my chance, and starting from that point, I have woven my net round him until now it is all ready to close. In 3 days, that is to say, on Monday next. The matter will be ripe, and the professor, with all the principal members of his gang, will be in the hands of the police. Then will come the greatest criminal trial of the century, the clearing up of over 40 mysteries, and the rope for all of them. But if we move at all prematurely, you understand, they may yet elude us even at the last moment. Now, if I could have done this without the knowledge of Professor Moriarty, all would have been well. But he was far too wily for that. He saw every step which I took to draw my toils around him. Again and again he strove to break away, but I as often headed him off. I tell you, my friend, that if a detailed account of that silent combat could be written, it would take its place as the most brilliant bit of thrust-and-parry work in the history of detection. Never have I risen to such a height, and never have I been so hard-pressed by an opponent. He cut deep, and I even deeper. This morning the last steps were taken, and 3 days only were wanted to bring the matter to a climax. I was sitting in my room thinking the matter over, when the door opened and Professor Moriarty stood before me. My nerves are fairly proof, Watson, but I must confess that I started when I saw standing before me the very man who had been so much in my thoughts. His appearance was well known to me. He is extremely tall and thin, his forehead doming out in a white curve, and his 2 eyes deeply sunken in his head. He is clean-shaven, pale, and ascetic-looking, retaining something of the professor in his features. His shoulders are rounded from much study, and his face projects forward and is forever slowly oscillating from side to side in a curiously reptilian fashion. He peered at me with great curiosity in his puckered eyes. "You have less frontal development than I should have expected," he said at last. "It is a dangerous habit to finger a loaded revolver in the pocket of one's dressing gown." The fact was that upon his entrance, I had instantly realized the extraordinary danger of my situation. The only conceivable escape for him lay in silencing my tongue forever. In an instant, I had slipped my revolver from the drawer into my pocket and was fingering it through the cloth. At his remark, I drew the weapon out and laid it, cocked, upon the table. Moriarty continued to stare at me, blinking and smiling, but there was something in his eyes that made me very glad that I had that revolver ready to my hand. "You evidently do not know me," he said. "On the contrary," I answered, "it seems fairly clear that I do. Pray take a chair. I can spare you 5 minutes if you have anything to say." "All that I have to say has already crossed your mind," said he. "Then possibly my answer has crossed yours," I replied. "You stand fast, then?" "Absolutely." He clapped his hand into his pocket, and I lifted the pistol from the table. But he merely drew out a memorandum book in which a few figures were scribbled. "You crossed my path on the 4th of January, said he. "On the 23rd you incommoded me. By the middle of February I was seriously inconvenienced by you. At the end of March you absolutely hampered my plans. And now, at the close of April, I find myself placed in such a position through your continual persecution that I am in positive danger of losing my liberty. The situation is becoming an impossible one. Have you any suggestion to make?" I asked. "You must drop it, Mr. Holmes," said he, swaying his face about. "You really must, you know. After Monday," I replied. "Tut, tut," said he. "I am quite sure that a man of your intelligence will see that there can be but one outcome to this. You must withdraw. It has been an intellectual treat to me to see the way in which you have grappled with this case, and I say, quite sincerely, that it would be a grief to me to be forced to take any extreme measure. You smile, sir, but I assure you that I speak in all truth. Danger is the companion of my trade. I remarked. "This is not danger," said he. "It is inevitable destruction. You stand in the way not merely of an individual, but of a mighty organization, the full extent of which you, with all your cleverness, have been unable to realize. You must stand clear, Mr. Holmes, or you will be trodden underfoot. I am afraid that the pleasure of this interview is making me neglect important business," I said, rising from my chair. He rose also and looked at me in silence, shaking his head sadly. "Well, well," he said at last. "It is a pity, but I have done what I could. I know every move of your game. You can do nothing before Monday. It is a duel between you and me, Mr. Holmes. You hope to place me in the dock. I tell you that I will never stand in the dock. You hope to beat me. I tell you that you will never beat me. If you are clever enough to bring destruction upon me, rest assured that I shall certainly do as much to you." "You have paid me several compliments, Mr. Moriarty," I answered. "Let me pay you one in return when I say that if I were assured of the former eventuality, I would, in the interests of the public, cheerfully accept the latter." "I can promise you the one," he snarled, and so turned his rounded back upon me and went peering and blinking out of the room. That was my singular interview with Professor Moriarty. I confess that it left an unpleasant impression upon my mind. His soft, precise fashion of speech leaves a conviction of sincerity which a mere bully could not produce. Of course, you will say, why not take police precautions? But the point is that the blow, when it comes, will be struck by his agents. I have the best of reasons for knowing that it will be so. Have you already been attacked? My dear Watson, Professor Moriarty is not a man who lets the grass grow under his feet. I went out about midday on business to Oxford Street, and as I turned the corner, a pair-horse van came charging down upon me at a gallop. I sprang onto the footway and only saved myself by a fraction of a second. The van dashed on and was gone in a moment. After that, as I walked down Vere Street, a brick came down from the roof of one of the houses and was shivered to pieces at my feet. I called the police, and we examined the place. There were slates and bricks piled upon the roof preparatory to some repairs, and the police would have me believe that the wind had toppled one over. I knew better, but I could prove nothing. After that I took a cab and drove to my brother's rooms, where I spent the day. Now, on my way to you, I was attacked by a rough with a bludgeon. I knocked him down, and the police have him in custody, but I can tell you with the most absolute confidence that no connection will ever be established between the gentleman whose front teeth have frayed my knuckles and the retiring mathematical coach, who is, I dare say, working out problems upon a blackboard 10 miles away. Now, Watson, you will not wonder that on my entrance I should be at some pains to close your shutters, and that I should prefer to leave your house by some less conspicuous exit than the hall door. I'd often admire my friend's courage, but never more than now, as he sat quietly recounting the incidents of this incredible day. "You will spend the night here?" I asked. "No, my friend, I should be a very dangerous guest. I have my plans all laid, and all will be well. Matters have gone so far now that they can proceed without my individual help. The arrest can be made without me, though my presence would be necessary for a conviction. It is obvious, therefore, that I should do best to get away for the few days which remain before the police can act with full liberty. And it would be a great pleasure to me if you would come on to the continent with me." "Well, my practice is not very absorbing at present," I replied, "and I have a neighbor who would be glad to look after my patients. I shall be delighted to come. And can you start tomorrow morning? If it is necessary." "Oh, yes, it is most necessary. Here is your instruction, then, my dear Watson, and I beg of you to follow it to the letter, for you are playing a game with me against the cleverest rogue and the most powerful syndicate of criminals in Europe. Now listen, you will send your luggage by a trusty messenger to Victoria tonight. In the morning you will send for a hansom, but tell your man that he is neither to take the first nor the second which presents itself. You will jump into the cab and drive to the Lowther Arcade, handing the address to the driver on a slip of paper with a request that he will not throw it away. Have your fare ready, and the instant that you reach the arcade, dash through it, so as to be at the other end by 9:15. You will find a small brougham waiting you at the corner, driven by a fellow in a heavy black cloak tipped with red. He will take you to Victoria in time for the Continental Express. Where shall I meet you? At the station. The second first-class carriage from the front will be reserved for us. The carriage is our rendezvous, then? Yes. It was in vain that I urged Holmes to remain for the night. It was evident that he felt he might bring trouble upon the roof that sheltered him. With a few last hurried words of instruction, he rose and went out with me into the garden, clambered over the wall into Mortimer Street, and immediately whistled for a hansom, in which I heard him drive away. In the morning I obeyed Holmes's injunctions to the letter. A hansom was procured with every precaution, and immediately after breakfast I drove to the Lowther Arcade. I hurried through the passage and found the brougham waiting for me, with a massive driver wrapped in a dark cloak. As soon as I had stepped in, he whipped up the horse, and we rattled off to Victoria Station. As I alighted, he turned his horses and drove rapidly away without so much as a glance in my direction. So far, all had gone well. My luggage was already there, and I had no difficulty in finding the carriage Holmes had indicated, the more so as it was the only one marked engaged. My only source of anxiety now was the non-appearance of Holmes. There were but 7 minutes before the train was due to start. I looked in vain among the crowd of travelers and loungers for the slender figure of my friend. He was nowhere to be seen. I spent a few minutes in assisting a venerable Italian priest, who was endeavoring to explain to a porter in very broken English that his luggage was to be booked through to Paris. Then, after another look around, I returned to my carriage, where I found my elderly Italian friend. The porter had ushered him in, despite the engaged sign. It was useless to explain to the priest that he had no right there, for my Italian was even more limited than his English. I could only shrug my shoulders and continue to look out anxiously for my friend. A cold chill of fear passed over me as I thought that some accident might have befallen him during the night. The guard had already closed the doors, and the whistle had sounded, when suddenly, "My dear Watson," said a voice, "you have not even condescended to say good morning to me." I turned in unutterable astonishment. The old priest was facing me. For an instant, the wrinkles were smoothed away, the nose moved back from the chin, the lower lip ceased to protrude, and the mouth to mumble. The dull eyes flashed with fire, and the bowed figure straightened itself. Then the whole form collapsed again, and Holmes had gone as quickly as he had appeared. "Good heavens!" I cried. "How you startled me!" "We must be careful," Holmes whispered. "I have reason to believe that they are hot upon our trail. Ah, there is Moriarty himself." The train had already begun to move as he spoke. Glancing out of the window, I saw a tall man frantically pushing his way through the crowd and waving his hand as if he meant to stay the train. But it was too late. Our speed rapidly increased, and we cleared the station. "With all our precautions, we have managed to give him the slip after all," said Holmes, laughing. He rose and, shedding his cassock and hat, stowed them away in his handbag. "Have you seen the morning papers, Watson?" "No." "Then you are unaware of what has happened in Baker Street." In Baker Street. They set fire to our rooms last night, though no great damage was done. Good heavens, Holmes. This is intolerable. They must have lost my trail completely after the arrest of the man with the bludgeon. Otherwise, they could not have imagined that I should return to my rooms. However, they have evidently followed you, and that is what brought Moriarty to Victoria. Did you make any slip? I did exactly what you advised. Did you find a brougham? Yes, it was waiting. Did you recognize the coachman? No, it was my brother Mycroft. It is an advantage to have someone of one's own in such matters, so as not to be forced to take a hired man into one's confidence. We must consider what to do about Moriarty. As we are on an express and the boat train runs straight through, I should think we have shaken him off. My dear Watson, you evidently did not observe me when I said that this man is my intellectual equal. You surely do not suppose that if I were the pursuer, I should allow myself to be baffled by so slight an obstacle. Why, then, should you think him so? What will he do, then? What I should do, and what would you do? Engage a special train, but must be late. By no means. This train stops at Canterbury, and there is always at least a quarter of an hour's delay at the boat. He will catch us there. One would think we were the criminals. Let's have him arrested the moment we arrive. It will be to ruin the work of 3 months. We should catch the big fish, but the smaller ones would swarm through the meshes of the net. On Monday, we shall have them all. No, an arrest is inadmissible. What then? We shall get out at Canterbury, and then, well, then we must make a cross-country journey to New Haven, and so over to Dieppe. Moriarty will again do what I should do. He will go on to Paris, find our luggage, and wait for us for 2 days at the depot. In the meantime, we shall treat ourselves to a couple of carpet-bags, thus encouraging the manufactures of the countries through which we travel, and make our way at our leisure into Switzerland, via Luxembourg and Ball. I am too old a traveler to allow the loss of my baggage to distress me much, but I confess that I was annoyed at being forced to skulk and hide before a man whose record was so fearful a one. It was evident, however, that Holmes understood the situation better than I. We alighted, therefore, at Canterbury, only to find that we should have to wait an hour before we could get a train to New Haven. I was looking sadly after the rapidly disappearing train which carried my luggage, when Holmes pulled my sleeve and pointed along the line. "See, already," he said. Far away, among the Kentish woods, there rose a thin column of smoke. A minute later we saw a locomotive and a single carriage sweeping round the curve. We had hardly time to settle ourselves behind a pile of luggage before it passed with a rattle and a roar, sending a puff of hot steam into our faces. "There he goes," said Holmes, as we watched the carriage swing and rock upon the rails. "That shows that there are limits to our friend's intelligence. It would have been a coup de maître had he deduced what I would deduce and acted accordingly. And what would he have done had he overtaken us? There cannot be the least doubt that he would have made a murderous attack upon me. It is a game for two, however. The question now is whether we should take a premature lunch here, or run our chance of starving until we reach the buffet at New Haven. We reached Brussels that night and stayed there for 2 days, and on the 3rd day we moved on to Strasbourg. On the Monday morning Holmes had telegraphed to the London police, and in the evening, upon our return to the hotel, we found an answer waiting for us. Holmes tore it open and with a curse flung it into the grate. "I might have expected it," he groaned. "He has escaped. Moriarty. They have secured the whole gang, with the exception of him. He has given them the slip. Of course, when I was not there, they had no one to match him. And yet I had imagined that I had placed everything necessary in their hands. I think that you had better return to England. Watson." "Why so?" because I am now a dangerous companion. This man's occupation is gone. He is a ruined man if he returns to London. If I read his character aright, he will now devote his whole energy to revenging himself upon me. He said as much during our short interview, and I fancy that he will keep his word. I advise you to return to your practice. It was hardly the sort of appeal that would move an old campaigner and an old friend like myself. We sat for half an hour arguing the matter in the salle à manger of our Strasbourg hotel, and that same night we continued our journey to Geneva. For a charming week we wandered up the valley of the Rhone, and then, passing over the Gemmi Pass, still deep in snow, we made our way by Interlaken to Meiringen. It was a lovely trip. The delicate green of the spring below contrasted with the virgin whiteness of the snow above. But it was evident that Holmes never for a single moment forgot the shadow which lay across his life. In the lonely alpine villages or in the high mountain passes, I could tell by his sharp, sidelong glances at every passerby that he was convinced that, wherever we might go, we could not escape the danger which followed hard upon our heels. Once, I remember, as we passed over the Gemmi and walked along the border of the melancholy Daubend Sea, a large rock, detached from the ridge upon our right, came thundering down and crashed into the lake behind us. In an instant Holmes had climbed up the ridge and, with his neck craned out, was looking in every direction. It was in vain that our guide assured him that a fall of stones was a common thing in that locality at that season of the year. Holmes said nothing, but he looked at me with the air of a man who sees the fulfillment of his own anticipations. And yet, for all his watchfulness, he was never in the least depressed. On the contrary, I can hardly remember ever having seen him in such buoyant spirits. He continually returned to the subject that if he could be assured that society was freed from Professor Moriarty, he would cheerfully bring his own career to a conclusion. I think I may go so far as to say, Watson, that I have not lived wholly in vain, he remarked. If my record were closed tonight, I could still survey it with equanimity. I have participated in over 1,000 cases, and I am not aware that I have ever used my powers upon the wrong side. Of late, I have been tempted to look into the problems furnished by nature rather than those more artificial ones for which our abnormal state of society is responsible. Your memoirs, Watson, will draw to a close upon the day that I crown my career by the capture or elimination of the most dangerous and capable criminal in Europe. I shall be brief, but exact, in the little which remains for me to tell. It is not a subject on which I would willingly dwell, and yet I am conscious that a duty is incumbent upon me to omit no single detail. It was on the 3rd of May that we reached the little village of Meiringen, where we put up at the Englischer Hof, then kept by Peter Steiler the elder. Our landlord was an intelligent man and spoke excellent English, having served for 3 years as a waiter at the Grosvenor Hotel in London. At his advice, on the afternoon of the 4th, we set off together, with the intention of crossing the hills and spending the night at the hamlet of Rosenlaui. We had strict injunctions, however, on no account to pass the falls of Reichenbach, which are about halfway up the hill, without making a small detour to see them. It is indeed a fearful place. The torrent, swollen by the melting snow, plunges into a tremendous abyss, from which the spray rolls up like the smoke from a burning house. The shaft into which the river hurls itself is an immense chasm, lined by glistening, coal-black rock and narrowing into a creaming, boiling pit of incalculable depth, which brims over and shoots the stream onward over its jagged lip. The sweep of green water drawing forever down, and the thick flickering curtain of spray hissing forever upward, turn a man giddy with their constant whirl and clamor. We stood near the edge, peering down at the gleam of the breaking water far below us against the black rocks, and listening to the half-human shout which came booming up with the spray out of the abyss. The path curves in a semicircle round the fall to afford a complete view of it, but it ends abruptly, and the traveler must retrace his steps by the same way he came. We had almost reached the end when we saw a young Swiss lad running toward us with a letter in his hand. It bore the mark of our hotel and was addressed to me by the landlord. He wrote that within a few minutes of our departure, an English lady had arrived at the hotel in the last stages of consumption. She had wintered at Davos and was now on her way to her friends in Lucerne when she was taken with a sudden hemorrhage. She was dying, and it would be a great consolation to her to see an English doctor, and if I would only return, and so forth. The good Steiler added in a postscript that he would take it as a great favor if I came, as the lady had resolutely refused to see a local doctor, and he felt a great weight of responsibility. How could one refuse the request of a countrywoman dying in a strange land? Yet I was loath to leave Holmes alone. At last, we agreed that the young Swiss should remain with him as a guide and companion, while I returned to Meiringen. My friend intended to linger for a while at the fall, and then make his way over the hill to Rosenlaui, where I was to join him in the evening. As I turned to descend, I saw Holmes standing with his back against a rock and his arms folded, gazing down at the rush of the waters. It was the last that I was ever destined to see of him. While I was near the bottom of the hill, I looked back once more. The fall was no longer visible, but I could see the path which winds along the shoulder of the mountain. Along this a man was walking rapidly. His black figure was clearly outlined against the green background. I noted him, but soon forgot him in my haste. In an hour I had reached Meiringen. Old Steiler was standing on the porch. "Well," said I, as I hurried up, "I trust she's no worse." A look of blank astonishment came over his face, and at the first quiver of his eyebrows my heart turned to lead. "You did not write a note?" I asked, pulling the letter from my pocket. "There is no sick Englishwoman in the hotel." "None," he answered, "but it has the hotel mark." "Huh! It must have been written by the tall Englishman who came after you had gone," he said, but I did not wait for the landlord's explanations. Shaking with horror, I ran down the village street and back toward the path which I had just descended. It had taken me an hour to come down. It was 2 hours, despite all my efforts, before I found myself again at the Reichenbach Falls. Holmes's alpenstock was still leaning against the rock where he had left it, but there was no sign of Holmes, and my shouts were answered only by my own voice, echoing from the surrounding cliffs. At the sight of the alpenstock, I grew cold and faint. So, Holmes had not gone to Rosenlaui. He had remained on that 3-foot path, with a sheer wall on one side and a fathomless abyss on the other, until his enemy had overtaken him. The young Swiss, too, was gone. He had doubtless been in the pay of Moriarty and had left the two men together. And what had happened then? Who was there to tell what had happened? I stood for a minute or two to collect myself, for I was stunned by the horror of it. Then I began to think of Holmes's own methods and to attempt to apply them to this tragedy. Alas, it was only too easy. We had gone to the very end of the path together, and the alpenstock marked our stopping place. The black soil is kept perpetually soft by the spray, and even a bird would leave its footmarks upon it. 2 lines of tracks were clearly visible at the end of the path, both leading away from me. There were no return marks. A few yards from the end, the soil was all trampled into mud, and the brambles and ferns which fringed the chasm were torn and shattered. I lied upon my face and peered over the edge. The spray was all around me. It had grown dark, and I could only see the glint of the moisture upon the black rocks and, far below, the shimmer of the breaking water. I shouted, but only that same half-human scream of the falls came back to my ears. Yet it was destined that I should receive one last greeting from my friend and comrade. I have already mentioned that his alpenstock remained leaning against the rock which jutted out over the path. On the top of that rock, I caught the glint of something bright, and reaching up my hand, I struck my fingers against the silver cigarette case which he was in the habit of carrying. As I took it up, a small square of paper, which had been lying under it, fluttered down onto the ground. Unfolding it, I found 3 pages torn from his notebook and addressed to me. It was characteristic of the man that the direction was as precise and the writing as firm and clear as though it had been written in his study. "My dear Watson," he wrote, "I write these few lines through the courtesy of Mr. Moriarty, who awaits my convenience for the final discussion of those questions which lie between us. He has been giving me a sketch of the methods by which he avoided the English police and kept himself informed of our movements. They certainly confirm the very high opinion which I had formed of his abilities. I am pleased to think that I shall be able to free society from any further effects of his presence, though I fear that it is at a cost which will give pain to my friends, and especially, my dear Watson, to you. I have already explained to you, however, that my career had in any case reached its crisis, and that no possible conclusion could be more congenial to me than this. To tell you the truth, I was quite convinced that the letter from Meiringen was a hoax, and I allowed you to depart on that assumption, being certain that some such development as this would occur. Tell Inspector Patterson that the papers which are necessary to convict the gang are in pigeonhole M, done up in a blue envelope and inscribed Moriarty. I made every disposition of my property before leaving England, and handed it over to my brother Mycroft. Pray give my greetings to Mrs. Watson, and believe me to be, my dear fellow, very sincerely yours, Sherlock Holmes. A few words may suffice to tell the rest. An examination by experts leaves little doubt that a personal contest between the 2 men ended, as it could hardly fail to end in such a situation, by their reeling over, locked in each other's arms, into the abyss. Any attempt at recovering the bodies was absolutely hopeless, and there, deep down in that dreadful cauldron of swirling water and seething foam, will lie for all time the most dangerous criminal and the foremost champion of the law of their generation. The Swiss lad was seen no more. He was no doubt one of those numerous agents whom Moriarty had at his disposal. As to the gang, it will be within the memory of the public how completely the evidence which Holmes had accumulated exposed their organization and the terrible grip which the dead man had held over them. The trial gave but few details of this terrible man, and if I have now been compelled to make a clear statement of his career, it is due to those injudicious champions who have endeavored to clear his memory by attacks upon him, whom I shall ever regard as the best and the wisest man whom I have ever known.